History is usually written in the blood of soldiers and the ink of treaties, but there is another ledger one, hidden in the vaults of central banks, the cargo holds of merchant ships, and the desperate rationing lines of starving cities. In 1913, the world was more interconnected than it would be again for nearly a century. A businessman in London could invest in a railway in Argentina, order tea from China, and buy gold from South Africa, all with the certainty that his currency was as solid as the ground he walked on. This was the Gilded Age of the gold standard. But in the summer of 1914, that fragile web of credit and commerce was shredded in a matter of weeks. We often ask how the world wars changed our borders. The more haunting question is how they changed the very value of the money in your pocket. This is the story of how approximately $23 trillion adjusted for today's inflation was incinerated in 30 years, and how from those ashes the modern financial world was born. The economic tragedy of the 20th century began not with a crash, but with a transition. Before the first shell was fired in 1914, Europe was the world's banker. The British pound sterling was the global reserve currency, and London was the undisputed clearinghouse of the world. When war broke out, the primary participants believed it would be over by Christmas. Because of this delusion, they did not prepare their economies for a long-term drain. However, as the conflict settled into the muddy stagnation of the trenches, the cost of war shifted from a manageable expense to an existential threat. To sustain the unprecedented rate of industrial slaughter, nations had to abandon the very foundations of their economic stability. The gold standard, which required every paper note to be backed by physical gold, was the first casualty. Governments realized that to win a total war, they could not be limited by the amount of yellow metal in a basement. They began to print money at a rate never before seen, decoupling the value of labor from the value of currency. As the European powers Britain, France, Germany, and Russia poured their accumulated centuries of wealth into the mud of the Western and Eastern fronts, a seismic shift began to occur across the Atlantic. The United States, which remained neutral until 1917, became the great provider for the first 3 years of the war. American factories and farms worked at full capacity to supply the Entente powers. This was the moment the United States transitioned from a debtor nation, one that owed money to Europe for its own industrialization, into the world's greatest creditor. By 1918, the British Empire, once the wealthiest entity on Earth, owed the United States billions of dollars. This was more than a change in accounting. It was a handover of global hegemony. The scepter of financial power was moving from the City of London to Wall Street. The end of the First World War in 1918 did not bring economic peace. Instead, it brought the peace of vengeance. The Treaty of Versailles imposed staggering reparations on Germany, totaling 132 billion gold marks. This was an economic impossibility. To pay these debts while rebuilding a shattered domestic economy, the German Weimar Republic engaged in the most famous instance of hyperinflation in history. By 1923, the German mark was so worthless that children played with stacks of banknotes like building blocks. And workers were paid twice a day so they could rush to the store before prices rose again in the afternoon. This economic vacuum destroyed the German middle class, radicalizing a generation and creating the fertile ground of resentment that Adolf Hitler would eventually exploit. The war had not only destroyed wealth, it had destroyed the public's trust in the very concept of money. The 1920s offered a brief, glittering illusion of recovery, fueled largely by American credit. However, the global economy was now a house of cards. When the U.S. stock market crashed in 1929, the shockwaves traveled instantly across the Atlantic. Because the world was now so reliant on American loans to pay off war debts and reparations, the Great Depression became a global contagion. For the first time, nations turned inward. Beggar-thinner policies became the norm as countries slapped high tariffs on imports to protect their own industries. This protectionism caused global trade to collapse by 2/3 in just 3 years. The economic lesson was clear. A world that had been globalized by war and debt could not survive if its nations retreated into isolation. As the 1930s wore on, the economic failures of the post-WWI era led directly to the rearmament of the 1940s. In Germany, Japan, and Italy, the command economy rose to prominence. These nations solved unemployment by pouring every available resource into the machinery of war. By the time World War II began in 1939, The scale of economic mobilization required was 10 times greater than it had been in 1914. This was no longer just a war of soldiers. It was a war of gross domestic product. The side that could build the most tanks, refine the most oil, and feed the most workers would be the victor. This total war philosophy meant that the civilian economy ceased to exist in Europe and Asia. Every loaf of bread and every ton of steel was a strategic asset. While World War II brought absolute ruin to the industrial hearts of Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union, it acted as a massive, violent stimulus package for the United States. Emerging from the lingering shadows of the Great Depression, the U.S. transformed its economy almost overnight. Between 1939 and 1945, the U.S. federal budget grew from $9 billion to nearly $100 billion. The government became the primary buyer of all goods, creating a guaranteed market that sparked a technological revolution. We see the echoes of this today in the jet engine, synthetic rubber, and the early foundations of nuclear energy and computing. The war forced the U.S. to innovate at a speed that would have been impossible in peacetime, and because the American mainland was never bombed. Its industrial base remained pristine, while the rest of the world's factories were reduced to rubble. The human cost was unfathomable, but the economic outcome was a radical redistribution of global power. By 1945, the United States possessed half of the world's manufacturing capacity and held 80% of the world's hard gold reserves. The war had effectively bankrupted the British Empire, which had spent its entire national treasure to hold the line against Nazism. In 1945, Britain was a victorious nation, yet its citizens were living on stricter rations than they had during the war. And the country was forced to take a massive loan from the U.S. just to keep the lights on. This marked the definitive end of the colonial era. European powers could no longer afford to maintain empires in Africa and Asia because the economic engine that powered those empires had been dismantled by 30 years of conflict. Even before the war ended, the world's leaders knew they could not return to the chaos of the 1920s. In 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their goal was to design a new global financial architecture that would prevent another Great Depression and, by extension, another world war. The result was the birth of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. They established a system where the US dollar was pegged to gold, and every other currency was pegged to the dollar. This turned the American currency into the global anchor. The world had moved from a gold standard to a dollar standard, a reality that persists to this day. The final piece of the puzzle was the Marshall Plan. Learning from the mistake of WWI, where Germany was crushed with debt, the United States decided to rebuild its former enemies. From 1948 to 1952, the U.S. pumped $13 billion, roughly $150 billion today, into Western Europe. This wasn't just an act of charity, it was enlightened self-interest. By rebuilding Europe, the U.S. created a wealthy market for its own exports and prevented the economic misery that might lead countries towards Soviet communism. This era saw the economic miracle in West Germany and Japan, where shattered nations were transformed into high-tech industrial leaders within a single generation. The war had destroyed the old world, but the recovery built the consumerist, interconnected world we inhabit today. As we look back at the century of total war, the economic impact remains staggering. The wars catalyzed the move toward massive government involvement in the economy, high progressive taxation, and the creation of the modern welfare state as a thank you to the mobilized masses. It also cemented the concept of the military-industrial complex, where the lines between private industry and national defense are forever blurred. The $23 trillion spent on these conflicts did not just disappear. It was a forced investment in a new world order. The wars did more than destroy cities, destroyed the old way of thinking. They taught us that a government can print its way to victory, but it must manage the peace with equal fervor. Today's global trade, your credit card, and the dominance of the dollar are all ghosts of the trenches and the factories of the 1940s. We live in a world built on the credit of the fallen. The ledger is finally balanced, but the price was everything.